live, so welcome everybody to Truth is Stranger. And we've got a fantastic panel today. We have the amazing Denise, Mina, Joseph Knox and Caroline Mitchell. And before we kick off, I'd just like to say a big thanks to Luca and Steve for having us along on this fantastic festival for a great cause. If you're watching along, you can ask questions in the chat. So please, anything that you think of, any questions you've got that you've been coming to this in mind, put them in there, because I'm probably going to run out of questions halfway through. So it'll be good to have some of these to plunder. And in the meantime, this panel is about truth, and in fact, true crimes being stranger than fiction. So I thought, just as a wild departure, we could all start off talking about our new books and how that fits in with true crime, because actually a lot of them seem to have some sort of true crime influence, particularly Joseph's, which is called True Crime Story. So I don't know if you want to kick off, Joseph.
Absolutely. Hello, thank you for having me. I am about to release my first ever standalone novel, which is called True Crime Story, and it's something a little bit different for me. It's quite hard to explain in a sense. Now I'm suddenly under pressure to say what it's actually about. It's really a blend of fact and fiction, and it attempts to explain my own peripheral involvement in a true crime case. The case is, was from 2011. It was a student from Manchester University who vanished essentially without a trace, and the book investigates really her friends and family. One of the things that I love about true crime and about crime fiction as well is that it's really an excuse to go rooting through other people's underwear drawers and things like that, and to really start to learn the dark secrets of the peripheral people involved in a crime. I think most people walk around in life thinking of themselves as generally quite good, upright, upstanding people, but how many of our lives would stand up to that kind of scrutiny? And so the book really examines that, and I don't get away from it unscathed either. So it was a lot of fun. It's very different, and I'm really excited to see what people think about it.
And it's got a very eye-catching cover. I was just saying before we came on, it actually sort of damaged my eyesight when I went to look at your website yesterday. So that's yeah. Memorable.
Blinding you all.
Okay, Denise or Caroline, do you want to talk a little bit about your latest, or any of the books that you've got that kind of come into this area of truth being stranger than fiction?
Well, I'll go very quickly. My book is The Less Dead, and I've made a fundamental Zoom error, which is I've rested my computer on the actual book that I'm supposed to be smashing about in front of your face. It's called The Less Dead, and it's based on a true crime case that happened in Glasgow. There were a series of murders of sex workers in Glasgow in the 80s and early 90s, and nobody really particularly cared. The police didn't really investigate that much until the very last one. And the very last one was a really lovely woman from a lovely family. She was very pretty, she was blonde, she was white. And I was very struck by the fact that that because she had to be sympathetic for anybody to really care. And the women before were not sympathetic. I knew some of those women, and they were not particularly, they didn't come from, so a lot of them grew up in care, and they didn't really have anybody to go on crime watch for them, And I was thinking about this in the context of Sarah Everard the past couple of weeks, and the fact that two sisters were found murdered in Wembley, and they couldn't even get the cops to go out and look for them. So it's called The Less Dead, and basically somebody gets in contact with her birth mother and finds out her birth mother was one of these women, and it was a way of looking at that whole issue. Because as crime writers, we're often accused of, only caring about certain types of victim, and I really wanted to look at that, because I don't think it's about the crime. I don't think it's about crime fiction. I don't think it's about the police. I think it's society-wide, and we really need to talk about it. So The Less Dead is a term that's used a lot in true crime, and it's when people talk about victims who don't really matter that much and don't really get investigated, and why. To look at how we could make people care about everybody that gets physically assaulted or murdered.
I made a mistake at the start of this and said, put your questions in the chat. Please don't do that. I'm being told now, put it in the Q&A. It will get lost in the chat. We've already got a couple of good ones, which I will pick up on in a minute. But Caroline, do you want to tell us a little bit about your book?
Yeah, this is Flesh and Blood. It's the fourth in the DIME Winter series, and really the whole series has got a bit of a theme running through it, because when I started creating my protagonist, I thought, what's the worst possible thing I can throw at this poor detective? So I was doing a genealogy thing at the time, and I was looking into my background, and I thought, gosh, what if you were adopted and you had this great family and your father's a superintendent and you're following in his footsteps, and then you find out that actually your real parents are the worst serial killers Britain has ever known. So, you know, someone like Fred and Rosemary West, and that's basically what I kind of based it on, that she discovers that her parents are called the Beast of Brentwood, but is very much influenced by Fred and Rosemary West. So throughout each book, it's, as well as the, you know, what she has to deal with, it's about her journey as well in coming to terms with it. And she's kind of wondering, it's nature versus nurture. You know, am I drawn to deal with serial killers because actually their blood runs through my veins? And she gets flashbacks, and it's great. It's really meaty actually to write, because the series is still going and there's still great subplots going on throughout it. So I've really enjoyed it. But yeah, I was very heavily influenced by that, and I thought, yeah, that probably is one of the worst things you can throw at someone, to find out they're your real parents. And of course, it's the ripple effect of how she's treated by everyone else as well, and how things change. So yeah, but this one I based in Clacton-on-Sea, which is where I used to work in CID myself as a police officer. So I had brilliant fun writing that.
Yeah, and that actually reminds me of a podcast that I listened to when I was researching an earlier book, which I think was the Happy Face Killer, which was a killer in the States. But what was different about this podcast was it was narrated by his daughter, and that was just like you were saying. She was sort of, you know, trying to answer that question of, you know, how much is genetics and how much is just, you know, that was dad. But yeah, it's sort of really interesting to think about the impact on the families of the killers, the perpetrators, as well as
when you go on
victims.
to have kids as well, do you see a resemblance there? Would you be looking at them thinking, I hope they don't pick up this gene, if there is such a gene, to turn you into someone like that? So yeah, it's interesting.
I'm already pretty worried about at least one of my kids. So we got a delivery. We had a birthday this week, and we got a delivery from Donald Russell, the sort of butcher in Aberdeenshire, and it comes in a big polystyrene box with dry ice and stuff. And it was a bit of a surprise, so people didn't know what was in it. And my middle daughter immediately, just matter-of-factly, asked if there was a head in there. I think it was a little bit disappointed when she found it was T-bone steaks. But, I'll just pick up briefly in my book. For the purposes of today, I'm Alex, sometimes I'm Mason, and my latest book is called Hunted, and it kind of revolves around this thing they've got in the United States called an Amber Alert, which is when a child is abducted, the authorities can send an alert to anybody's phone within the area. So if somebody goes missing in Los Angeles, they can immediately ping the smartphones of like 2 million people, if just in the area. And I thought, you know, this was a really interesting thing to look at. If you had an innocent person who was flagged with this alert, and then suddenly you've got millions of eyeballs looking for this person, and how do you stay below the radar in this day and age, and that sort of scope. And the other kind of true crime thing that comes into it is some of the chapters are supposed to be excerpts from podcasts, and I did a lot of research listening to true crime podcasts for this, actually, just because I like listening to true crime podcasts. And this one I tried to make it a little bit different. This was, rather than looking at historical crime that had happened decades or even just months ago, this one was actually supposed to be happening at the same time as the case as it was unfolding, which is probably completely impractical in real life, but I thought it'd be quite interesting if something like that did happen. And the people recording the podcast, not surprisingly, get brought into the case as well. So it's probably my most true crimey book to date. So it's sort of quite appropriate for this panel. So we've already got a few questions coming in on the Q&A, which is brilliant. First one from Alex, another Alex, Alex Hawley. Why do we think that true crime has suddenly become more popular? Has it become more popular, or has it always been this popular?
I think it's much more popular now. I mean, it used to be, I remember going to Harrogate, and there was a brilliant book out called The Hunting of David Alualia by Kester Aspen. And we went for lunch, and we were talking in hushed tones about how much we loved true crime. I mean, you just wouldn't do that now. I mean, it used to be a real kind of nerdy, weirdo area of interest. And I became really, really interested in it. And people would give you into trouble for liking true crime or citing true crime. And they would say, that's very distasteful. But I did a documentary about Edgar Allan Poe, who's supposed to have invented detective fiction. And actually, Edgar Allan Poe, his early works that all detective fiction is based on, or he called it ratiocination, because he was so bad at branding, he always got everything slightly wrong. But they were all based on true crime. They were based on true crimes. And he was a newspaper man. Now, they used to have a thing in newspapers called a cock. This is genuinely what it was called. And they used to produce like pamphlets about crimes that were happening, and they sold really, really well. This is before crime was in the papers. And a cock was a fake true crime that they bigged up to sell because it was a quiet period because there just weren't that many murders. So all detective fiction and crime fiction, which is now very serious and taken as a very literary form, actually comes from true crime. So we're not actually, true crime isn't really the dirty little cousin of, literary detective fiction. Almost everything is true crime. And actually, when you sit most writers down and ask them, I think people are being more open about the fact that they've been very influenced by true stories now. It used to be, you used to say, I wrote this book because I read Herodotus and I was very influenced. No one ever read Woman's Own. Do you know what I mean? It was always the dead man that everybody reckoned, or Dickens or something like that. But now people will say, I read about this in the paper, or I heard a podcast, and it really stayed with me. So I think true crime's coming out of the closet. Yeah, definitely.
I'm glad there are no cocks in newspapers anymore.
That's right.
Those days are gone. Those days are gone.
Piers Morgan was on the front page yesterday.
But what are you saying? You're inviting now just the Twitter storm of your lifetime. I used to be a bookseller, and one of the interesting things about the true crime section was that it was always, because exactly as Denise said, it is kind of always been this shameful thing. And in every bookshop I ever worked in, probably like 15 or 20 all told, it was always in the worst possible corner of the building, hidden away. No bookseller ever wanted to touch it. It always looked like a bomb had gone off there. But the most shoplifted part of the shop, there are sections of bookshops which, frankly, as a bookseller, you put them on the shelf, you never need to look at it again because people care so little about the subject. True crime was not like that. True crime was always bombed. It was always attacked by people day and night. And I think there has been this kind of literary resistance to it for whatever reason. And maybe writers and publishers are really just catching up with the appetite that has always been there. In terms of my own introduction to true crime, I think the way that I fell in love with crime fiction came from an experience with true crime. I grew up in Stoke-on-Trent, which is why I tell people I'm from Manchester, because Stoke-on-Trent is the only place that makes Manchester look really glamorous. And so I actually grew up there, and as a little boy, my first experience with true crime came from a kind of first-hand example, in that our next door neighbor was the local postman, and he suddenly went from this guy who would look after us when our parents weren't around to this guy whose face was on the front page of all the local newspapers. And it turned out he had been stealing the post. And as a little kid, it was this really rude awakening that people live double lives and people aren't necessarily what they present themselves as. All very interesting, but it took a terribly dark turn because, of course, he was fired. He became this pariah in town, and sadly, really sadly, he murdered his wife. He had a complete break from reality and killed this woman who had minded us as children. and I can't remember exactly how old I would have been. I'm certainly still in primary school when this happened. And to see a neighbor kind of go from an upstanding member of the community to a pariah to a convicted killer was a really shocking entry into adulthood in some senses. And it was only when I was at an event a couple of years ago, and this blurted out of me, that I really remembered it, that I really remembered this huge impact it had on me, because I had just pushed it away as much as possible. And he was out of jail pretty quickly, and I saw him around town a lot as a kid, and it was a strange thing to try and intellectualize and understand. And I think I've carried that with me, and it's become this snowballing obsession with true crime and crime fiction as well. Although I think the two things are quite different, even when we're playing with true crime in a fictional setting. It's an interesting thing.
Yeah, I've got a true crime YouTube channel as well, and I put about 35 videos on there, thinking, you know, a few people might watch it, but geez, within a really, really short space of time, I had a couple of 100,000 views, and it was taking off so much that I wasn't actually getting time to write my books, and I had to pull back from it because it was taking so long. But I did learn that there's a huge true crime community on YouTube, certainly, where anyone can go on and you know, talk about real life cases. And there's some very strange cases out there as well. Like, I was looking at cases of these 12-year-old girls who took their friend off to the woods and stabbed her 19 times because Slenderman told them to. And the case of Elisa Lam, where she went, I know it was on Netflix, where she went missing in the Cecil Hotel in Manhattan, and she was in the lift making all sorts of weird movements and was seen on CCTV, and the tenants were drinking the water, and it was quite foul tasting, and her body was then found in one of the water tanks floating, and nobody knows what happened to her. And it was so many of these strange, bizarre cases, but the following is absolutely huge. There's some great channels on there. And the thing I found with it is, though, you have to really research it, because some people are so into true crime, and there's all these great Reddit groups, which like huge followers.
Yeah.
But if you don't research it, I mean, I was only getting a week, because it was taking me a week to produce, edit, research, and if you don't research it inside out, they'll tell you all about it. And I thought, oh my gosh, I need more time to do this, and of course I slowed down a bit. But yeah, YouTube is a great place to find some great true crime channels. It's absolutely fascinating. You could just find a good channel. There's a really good one called That Chapter, which is an Irish guy. He's got over 1 million followers, and you could just binge watch all of his and have nightmares for like a month afterwards.
My wife actually watches a true crime YouTube channel. I think it's YouTube, it might be Facebook Live, where a woman actually does her makeup and talks about grisly murders. So she gives like makeup tips and murders at the same time, which
Sounds like the one of me.
Bailey Saradin, she is.
That means that you've reached peak point, because there was a bit during the misery memoirs fad where misery memoirs stopped selling. So this woman wrote a misery memoir and a cookbook. So it was like my dad beat me with a wire hanger. This is how I make chicken soup. It was like obviously she'd written a misery memoir, and the publisher said no one wants them anymore. And she said, well, I can cook as well.
It's like that on the true crime channels. They're diversifying as well. They're doing true crime mukbangs, where they'll talk about true crime and stuff their face with KFC at the same time. And there's all sorts of weird things over there. Yeah.
Coincidentally, my next book is a cookbook. It's a series of crisp sandwiches, which is all I'm capable of.
But that Elisa Lam case, that was one of the very first long reads. It was the most read long read in the whole of the internet history. The internet, that's how old I am. It was called American Horror Story. Yeah. And it was way before anybody. I mean, it's such a great article, that article. The structure of it's great, not to be too nerdy, but the structure of it is absolutely fantastic. And you know, it's really compassionate, and it leaves open questions. And if anybody's looking for a good old read, if people still read, that's and it's just free for nothing on the internet. It's called An American Horror Story about Elisa Lam.
Yeah, but it just shows. I mean, I think there's a sort of kind of image of it becoming more, or true crime becoming more popular now, because you get Netflix documentaries and podcasts and things. But really, when you think about it, it's always been thus. I mean, you know, back to the days of Jack the Ripper, you had these sort of sort of penny magazines coming out, sort of recounting the crimes then. And if you've ever sort of walked past the sort of weekly magazine section in a newsagent, those headlines are more bloodthirsty than anything in our books. I mean, there's just really sort of extreme stuff there.
It went through a real kind of low shortly before In Cold Blood, which really elevated the form and then was almost completely ignored until Norman Mailer wrote the Executioner song, ripping off In Cold Blood like 3 years after it came out, and he won the Pulitzer. And the form got really stuck. So if you read a lot of true crime then, it always followed exactly the same form, which was a sort of generational biography, a description of the geography of the area and all this kind of thing. And they just got quite tedious. So people are really breaking that open. And I think all the different forms have really changed that, you know?
Yeah. I'm going to dip back into the Q&A. There's a couple of questions I'm going to go with together because they're similarly themed. Laura Burrow has asked, how do friends and families of the real victims typically react to us writing about their stories? Not always have written directly about that, of course. And similarly, Ali Kennedy has asked, do you feel extra pressure when writing a book based on a true crime to do justice for the families? I could actually start talking about this one because actually when Joseph was speaking about the crime in his neighbourhood, it reminded me there was a couple of murders in the town that I grew up in when I was really young, like 2 or 3 years old, and I actually did a documentary about it with CBS Reality a couple of years ago, just looking at those, and that was something that was always in my mind and in the production team's mind as well, that you didn't want to sensationalize it, or it certainly wouldn't want to sort of cause hurt to any of the families. And that was one thing that was in my mind the whole time, and I was really relieved when the show went out and one of the family members got in touch to say that they were kind of dreading watching it, but actually it was dealt with quite sensitively. So that was definitely good. But I don't know how you guys have found, if you've touched on sort of real crimes in your work, if you've been contacted by the families or if that's in your mind.
The first time I approached a true crime in a kind of fictional setting was with my second Aidan Waite's book, which is called The Smiling Man, and it was based on a real life suspected murder, the Somerton Man, and it was a incredibly strange case, and a lot about it appealed to me. For example, he was this man found in the late 40s in Australia on a beach with a slip of paper sewn into his trousers, which already sounds like the opening of a detective novel, and so it caught my eye in that sense. And when they examined this slip of paper, they saw it had been torn from the end of a book of poetry, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, and it was the part of the book which says the end. So very ominous stuff straight away. The book that the slip of paper was torn from was traced to a car that had been, it had its top down or something like that, and the book had just been thrown, discarded into the back. And when the authorities found this book, they discovered that it was covered in this code, which to this day has never been broken. So all of that was absolutely fascinating to me, and I had a character who was someone searching for his own identity, and it just seemed like one of those perfect moments where you find the perfect plot for your character. But I think the thing that drew me most towards it and made that story most perfect for me was that I did not really have to deal with the fallout potentially of upsetting victims, because I think that is, there are times when I think it's indefensible, depending on how a writer really approaches the story. We have all seen salacious stories that could have been told with more sympathy. And so I really wanted to avoid all of that. And of course, because I was changing facts of the case, because I was writing a fictional narrative, it really appealed to me that so much time had passed since the crime. With my new book, True Crime Story, I think really a large part of the book is about that tension, and is about, or is at least asking questions about the complicity of crime writers and true crime writers in the stories that we choose to tell. And without giving anything away, I suppose, you know, that is so much of the tension throughout the book, and it's something that I really have spent, I suppose, like the last year kind of dwelling on. And you know, you can discover my conclusions to those questions for $14.99 when but no, it really was an interesting thing. I think it is an interesting question for a crime writer to ask themselves, you know, where am I in relation to real victims? And particularly as we begin to play with these true crime narratives, it's one that we have to really keep in mind, I think.
Yeah, I used to work with victims of crime, so I'm always really, really mindful of the long-term effects as well. And certainly on YouTube, there's a lot of sensationalist channels which don't handle things very well. And also not just for the victims, but sometimes the perpetrators as well. I know I did a case about this young chap who was very mentally ill, and he murdered all his family on Halloween night. And you can't sensationalize, and you can't make, you know, nothing's black and white in the world, and you just share the story without I don't know, without taking sides, I guess. But certainly for the victims, I have had people contact me and thank me for getting the story out. When it comes to crimes in which the victim maybe hasn't been found or they're still missing, they like to have it shared and get it out there, but in a very sensitive manner. And I'm always really careful to handle things sensitively as I can, because every time I make a video, I think to myself, well, how would you act if you know that victim's watching that, or a member of their family is actually watching that? How would you talk about them and how would you act? And I think that's the best way of doing it, really. And in crime thrillers and crime fiction, I always like to imbue a good message, even if there's something like a serious sexual assault or something horrible that happens in the story. I always try and make the women regain their power at the end. You know, I've had ones where the victims have actually killed the antagonist in the end and got their power back that way. And I always trying to, you know, push a positive message forward rather than just make it this big sensationalist crime thriller.
I wrote a book called The Long Drop, which was about a real case and that happened in the 50s. And I thought I was golden because no one in the story actually had children. But some very elderly sons of one of the victims came to see me, and it suggested that the person who was convicted of the crime was not necessarily the only person involved in the murder. And that was sort of a story that people in Glasgow knew, but it wasn't in the court case or the coverage. And they came to see me and they said that they had always believed that, and they were sick to death of hearing how innocent everybody was. But at the same time, the ethics of proposing that someone is a murderer when they're dead really hadn't occurred to me, because you are tarnishing somebody's memory. And to be honest with you, it really had not occurred to me. But very clearly, he was. I mean, very clearly he was. So what do we then do? Do we then refuse to do that because he's not here to defend himself? Do we refuse to engage? I mean, there is a certain argument for, you know, if you're a writer and you're presenting a story and it has true elements, you do have to have a bit of flint in your heart, because they can't give me permission, because there are other people involved in that story. So I can't take that as a carte blanche to, oh, well, that's fine, I did well. You know, we either don't ever talk about any crime or any military venture. Can't talk about the Vietnam War in case you upset somebody who was involved in the decision making in the Vietnam War. At a certain point, you have to say, I'm making an unpopular decision. I'm going to discuss this undiscussable thing, and I'm going to propose certain things. And if you're very angry at me, then I will stand there and I will take you being very angry at me, because fair play. But we can't all be, you know, I mean, we're talking about really dramatic, appalling events, sometimes the worst things. My last book, The Less Dead, I was going to use the names of all the victims who were unlauded and largely forgotten, as the police captain, as the lawyer, as the doctor. And I went to see the police officer who investigated the case in the first place. And she said, no, you can't do that. She said, that's wrong to do that. She said, there's people involved in that case who don't know those people were involved in that, who don't know that their auntie was murdered, who don't know that their auntie was a sex worker. And she basically, she slapped me across the back of the legs and said, you're not allowed to do that. So I didn't. She was right. She was right. Do you know what I mean? And it was for the best possible motive, but it was the wrong thing to do. And I think you have to just keep listening to people. And when you're wrong, just say, yeah, that was wrong of me and I did the wrong thing there, but it's published now and they won't let me take it back. But you will be wrong at certain points, and you just have to be morally culpable and say, well, you know, I did my bit. I mean, I don't know if you saw the documentary about the Yorkshire Ripper, but the representation of the women who were killed by the Ripper was appalling.
Yeah.
At the same time, given the times, for a lot of the people involved in that, they were doing their best. They hadn't a clue what they were supposed to be doing. They did their best. They represented it according to the 70s values, which, you know, I grew up in and was creepy as get out. And they were doing their best. And maybe they were very wrong. And the thing to do now is not to say I wasn't wrong, but to say I was wrong and I can see that now. And I'm very sorry for the harm I caused. So I think we have to keep an open mind that we might be the bad guys, but we want to talk about these things because they are ruptures in society. They're really important to talk about.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, I thankfully never had any sort of close relationship to something that's happened, a serious murder or anything like that. But even reading The Long Drop, that was the first kind of big true crime thing I'd read that really focused on a crime that was near where I grew up. And just, one of the murders was right along the road from where I grew up in Burnside. And even that kind of hits you a little bit differently than reading about something set in, Washington or just in the other side of the planet. So yeah, it's definitely something to bear in mind. Casey Davis has asked, what is the most disturbing, shocking or memorable true crime story you have read or learned of? Anybody want to jump in on that?
I'll go first. There's a story and it's in Vanity Fair. It's just beautiful, right? So I hope the family of this man are not listening. A traveling salesman is in a hotel room in Texas and he is found dead in his room. He's in his 50s. He doesn't keep great health. They assume it's a heart attack. So they open him up, no wounds at all. He's found face down, head towards the door. And they take him in and they discover that the man has been shot through the heart, but there are no bullet holes on him. And he was alone in the room. So after a lot of investigation, it turns out, now, guys, you might want to brace yourselves a little bit. So he's an older gentleman, right? There are guys at a sales conference in the room next door through the adjoining room. One of them gets very, very drunk and he says, as Americans do, I believe, I've got a gun, I'm going to go and get my gun. So he goes down to the car and he gets his gun and he brings it up. And to show off to the other salesman, which is probably the start of most wars, he fires the gun and he doesn't know where the bullet went, right? Now, the man who died is in his room. He's just gotten up. They've been up all night. He goes to pick up the newspaper, bends down, gets shot through the testicular sac, falls down, and of course the skin immediately clams shut because it's stretchy skin. So it clams over the bullet hole, and that's how the guy eventually confessed, and I think went to prison for it. But that, to me, that is just like, I've told loads of people that story, and most men, I can see from both of your eyes, are thinking, are you threatening me?
You can sort of tell we're crossing our legs.
After you tell that story, they say, did that really happen? But it's just a fascinating kind of closed room mystery. It's just sort of beautiful and unbelievable. And you couldn't put it in a book because it's too unbelievable.
One like that occurs to me. I wouldn't say it's a particularly memorable true crime for any other circumstance other than the kind of twisted irony of it, the brutal kind of black humor of life, which was a guy who is currently in jail in America. It had all become too much for him. He was depressed. His life wasn't working out. He wasn't good enough for his partner who he loved. And so he decided to take his own life. And he had a gun because he was in America, I guess. And he put the gun to his head and attempted to shoot himself, missed. The bullet went through into the next room and shot his beloved wife in the head. And so he's now in prison for her murder after trying to take his own life because he didn't think he was good enough for her. I mean, that feels like one of those noir novels from the post-war American period where it's 100 pages long. The guy never wrote anything else, and you wonder how true it is. In terms of ones that of true crime stories that I think have haunted me, the one that really has stuck with me recently, as far as I know, doesn't really include a murder. It's this story that has been all over the BBC. They did a very excellent podcast about it, but the missing crypto queen. And it was essentially a very intelligent woman had come up with this fake cryptocurrency, a fake Bitcoin, and it appears that, of course, it was a really conventional pyramid scheme in a lot of ways. And there was never going to be any money coming out of the other end of it, but it essentially invited people to pour their life savings into this currency which doesn't exist and which they were told is going to go live any minute. There are a lot of people who still believe that currency is going to go live. It still hasn't, and it never will. And the amount of money and the amount of lives the amount of money that they took and the amount of lives that they ruined is just so hard to believe. I mean, they have taken billions out of the UK alone, but really where the crime, its teeth really sink in is in much poorer parts of the world where people have kind of poured their last pennies into this thing, expecting to become millionaires or rich or double their investment or what have you, and the money has just vanished. And something about that really haunts me, because I think it really speaks to our time in a sense. There is this level where there is almost like a cult-like belief in this currency for the people who still are keeping the faith, and there are a lot of them, believing that this currency is going to go live. They will not hear a word said against it. They will not believe any of the facts presented against it. And it kind of makes me think that to them, this kind of magical currency, which is going to make them rich, is more believable than the injustice of the world. In a sense, I think it's easier to believe that there is going to be this thing that solves everyone's problems than it is to believe things are as fucked as they are. And something about that absolutely haunts me. And I'm obsessed with the idea. I don't know how to put it into a book, but really, I think what I'm really interested in crime fiction and true crime is duplicity, dishonesty, lies. It isn't necessarily bloodbaths, and it isn't necessarily, a serial killer on the run. Sometimes it really is just someone coldly fucking over millions of people at a glance and not even looking back for a second. And what it says about those people and what it says about the world that we're living in, where I don't want to say that they're easily fooled. It's more that they want something to believe in. It's the opposite of being easily fooled. There's almost something noble sounds like the wrong word, but there is almost something good in those masses of people who just want something good to believe in. And of course, they are then exploited to the absolute full. And I think, like, for me, that is true crime in a nutshell.
Yeah, and I think the scariest monsters are the ones who you least expect it from, as in American Murder, which was on Netflix and absolutely huge on YouTube on the true crime channels as well. And I think people, they're almost more comforted by the villain twirling the mustache, and that you can see that they're a killer. You can see they're bad people, as like Fred West or type people, or Moira Hindley. You always kind of look at the pictures and things, you look, something wrong with you. But it's the more normal looking families and the more normal looking people, I think, that frighten people more, because I certainly had nightmares after watching that and researching it. And this man who basically, he seemed to have everything. He was really happy. Him and his wife had a really loving, happy marriage. They had 2 small children. She put everything on Facebook. She put their whole lives on Facebook because she used to sell this product, and she used her happy family life to sell these health products. and he murdered them. And it started off with her friend calling the police. She had a really good friend who was really insisting that she should be home. She's not home. Where are the children? And he was at work, and he was saying, no, it's fine. And she's like, no, I'm calling the police. And the police came, and it was so bizarre. Everything was filmed, which made it all the more amazing to watch this documentary, because everything was on the officer's camera. So you can see his reactions, you can see his body language, and he's cacking himself basically when the police come in and he's lying and say, oh, look, I found her phone, and oh, look, I found her wedding ring. I wonder where she is. And really, when he'd come to the house, he'd just come back from disposing of them in an oil tankard, where he disposed of his pregnant wife and 2 small children. And they were beautiful children. I mean, it's heartbreaking to imagine that all along he was having this affair. He didn't want another child. And you can kind of see it. It even shows the time when she says to him on FaceTime, oh, he's coming in now, I'm going to tell him I'm pregnant again. And she's wearing this t-shirt which says, oops, I did it again. And she's all happy, and the children are all excited. And he's like, oh, and you can see the look on his face. And I think that's almost like the deciding moment when he was like, okay, this isn't going to happen. And it's just kind of horrible to watch, but yet at the same time, you can't stop watching it. And I think that's what's made it so huge in America. It's just this really nice guy, handsome chap, you know, who's an all-American guy next door who'll do anything for you, could turn around and do something so horrendous to his family, and and play along with, you know, acting the innocent. And of course, he was eventually found, and there was a lot of hatred for Nicole, the mistress. And certainly when I did the video, oh my God, I got a lot of hate comments on that, because they felt like I let her off too light, that basically I should be diverting all my hatred towards her, when actually he's the man responsible, he did it. And there was a lot of victim blaming as well, which is really odd. And that's, they're saying, oh, well, she put her whole life on Facebook and, you know, pretending to be this happy person that she wasn't. And it was also bizarre. And it still is very bizarre. There's a lot of videos out about it. So I stepped away from it and kind of went, okay, I'm not going to look at the comments anymore. It's all getting a bit crazy. But yeah, people are very opinionated on it. But it is an absolutely horrendous crime that just this innocuous guy. And I think they're the most terrifying of all killers. It's the people that you look at and you just least expect it.
Yeah. I guess one that just sort of occurred to me that sort of stayed with me for, I guess, different reasons is this guy, and this was actually just because it was so bizarre. It was a chap in America who decided to commit suicide, but he wanted to frame himself, well, not frame himself, but frame it as a murder so that the life insurance would pay out. And they found him dead on a stretch of coastline, nobody else around. He'd been shot, I think, through the heart, and it looked like it was a mugging gone wrong or something, but he still had his wallet on him. And they started looking into his background and had a look at his internet searches, and found that he'd done a lot of searches about weather balloons. And it turned out what he'd done was to get a gun, tie it on a string to a weather balloon, shoot himself, and then the gun was taken away and drifted out over the ocean where it was lost. And it just kind of really pissed me off, because, you know, that's such a great sort of crime that he came up with, and then screwed up with the Googling. Like, you know, he came up with that all by himself, but then couldn't think, I should go and look at this on an internet cafe or something. But and then subsequently, a couple of years later, one of my writer friends had actually come up with this independently as a great idea for a murder, and I had to break it to them. Oh, is that, well, at first I said, oh, is that based on that time the guy did that? And he said, what do you mean? So I had to go and find a news link and say, this one, sorry. So, but yeah, well, so that one always sort of stays in my head, because, yeah, God, use an internet cafe.
Just the thought of the pain in the arse of trying to get the target perfect of that annoys me. Just like how shit I am with technology, how bad I am at any kind of drone-like activity. I just think I would lose patience with that before. I think I would finally just, you know, give up. The drone would fall into the sea. I'd swim out, find the gun, and just shoot myself in the head.
Well, that's the other thing. I would definitely fuck it up. I would shoot myself in the shoulder or something. So yeah.
In the testicles.
Yeah. While you were bending down to get the paper. Yeah.
It's always the way.
So we've got an interesting question in here. We're actually kind of down to the last 10 minutes almost, but this one from anonymous attendee, the mysteriously named, who has asked if any of us are tempted to cross over to the detective role. when we're writing about true unsolved murders? Do you think we could bring a perspective that has the potential to resolve some of these mysteries?
Well, Caroline's talking there about Reddit, and I don't know if you're ever on Web Sleuths. That's fascinating. But and actually, they have solved quite a few crimes, cold crimes, that police just didn't have the resources to sort of give to them. I'm a shabby idiot, and so I think I might be as well staying away from the whole solving crimes issue, because I do have the attention span of a puppy, and I know I would miss it. And I think if you watch really good police procedurals, they feel a little bit plodding, and that's because that work is quite plodding, and you have to constantly question your own, perspective and make sure that you're not bringing your own agenda. It's just like psychotherapy, So I think I would probably be better off staying away from that kind of thing. But I do love investigating, like, areas for stories, or, I do love going down. In fact, I'm in the middle of writing a book that very heavily features the Elizabeth Gardner museum robbery. It was the highest value museum robbery. And I spent about 3 weeks in researching it for the book. And I put the telly on last night, and there's a big Netflix series that's brought out. I just wasted all that time. And they've got I was trying to work out the interiors, and I was doing street view to work out where the door was. Spent a whole morning on that. I just have waited out 2 days, and it would have all been on Netflix. But I don't have the attention to detail for that, so I think I better stay away from that.
Anybody else? Caroline would be kind of cheating since you were a cop, so that's probably a bit easier for you than for us.
Yeah, actually, that's what I enjoy about writing crime now, is that I really miss the investigative side of it, and I really miss interviewing. I still love interviewing and the whole psychology of it. And I don't know if anyone's watched Mindhunter. I'm sure everyone's watched Mindhunter on Netflix. Absolutely brilliant. Or read anything by John Douglas. All that side of it really fascinates me. And I guess in a way I get to relive that investigative role again when I write my books. And yeah, it's good. It's a comfort when I miss the old slogging back in the police station. So I write instead. I have the much nicer side of it in comfort in my living room in the forest here. But it's great fun. It's really good fun investigating from a very safe perspective, certainly.
I would be a horrible detective in every possible way. I've written 3 books with a detective protagonist, and he's a horrible detective as well. And he's like the best I can do. It always amazes me when I read a crime novel and, the cool detective gets out of the car, and it's like, the people nearby whispering, oh shit, he's the best. He's the best. He's a genius, and he sees things that no one else does. And I just think, Jesus, wow, I don't have the intelligence to write that guy. I can write an idiot kind of falling into the mystery, and that's it. And, maybe his knuckleheadedness leads to some kind of resolution down the line, but I certainly don't. And as well, anyone who has read those books knows that my grasp of police procedure is non-existent. So I would be a horrible detective. And likewise, attention span. I'm more interested in when I'm writing fiction in trying to make it look cool and sound interesting and find an angle. And I think if I was involved in a real kind of penetrating, unfolding as it happened true crime, everyone else would have moved on to the 3rd murder scene, and I'd still be in the first one, kind of looking in the corners for that clue that I'm sure is there.
Yeah, I'm the same. I'm 99% sure I would be an absolutely useless investigator. And the only sort of 1% that gives me pause is I think I'm actually quite good at accomplishing things when I'm procrastinating. So it's a really great time to get some DIY done. Or I once sort of compiled a spreadsheet that itemized the contents of the freezer that was actually really useful for meal planning. So I think maybe if I was on a deadline and a murder came up, I would probably throw myself into that with such sort of reckless abandon that I might get somewhere. So somebody's asked a question sort of picking up, I think, on one of our other topics of conversation here. How do you protect yourself when doing dubious web searches? It doesn't specify exactly what kind of dubious web searches, but let's just assume it's around crime. Is there a way to let the authorities know in advance without looking suspicious? That kind of reminds me of when Ian Rankin was doing pre-internet research and went to ask the police about a crime he'd come up with that unfortunately matched a real crime that they were investigating, so they immediately put him at number one in his suspect list. So that was the analog version of that, I guess.
My husband sleeps with one eye open. I'm continually researching how to kill people without showing up on autopsies, and if you get insurance and how to get insurance when your loved one dies and things like that. So I think he is a bit worried at times, but no one's come and arrested me yet.
Yeah, I've never really thought about it, to be honest, and I probably should.
Like you're talking about the crypto queen there. There are, I mean, I've never cleared my history or anything, but there are big gaps in everyone's understanding of technology, but nobody wants to admit them, do they? So the thing about the crypto queen was people didn't really understand cryptocurrency. But they didn't want to say. So there's a really interesting thing happening now in contemporary artworks where you buy essentially the copyright of the internet. That you're paying $1 million for a screenshot essentially, and then you own the screenshot, and it is clearly nonsense. But nobody wants to be the person, because they've come up with what's called an MFA or something like that. Nobody wants to say, that sounds like pants. That just sounds like made up rubbish. Nobody wants to, Emperor's New Clothes it. And that's, I mean, I think a lot of people are conning folk out of money using that. But I think everybody has their sort of blind spots with technology. I certainly that's never occurred to me, and I'm not going to sleep tonight. NFT, Liesl says.
You can get NordVPN, which I have used before, which will actually even say you're from a different country if you need it to, which is quite useful if you want to watch Netflix in the US more than anything else. I've not been up to anything too bad, but yeah, no, if anyone is trying to search for things they're worried about, NordVPN is quite a good thing to do. Or incognito searching, I think you can do online as well.
Can I just say fungible? Fungible means, it's a legal term, and it means something that breaks down. So you have two categories of property in law: non-fungible, which is like a house or a road, and fungible, which is tomatoes. So they'll disappear, but non-fungible is something that doesn't degrade. And
it takes an incredible amount of, doesn't it use like the energy that a city would require for a day or something?
Bitcoin.
Like there's some insane.
It's the whole of Argentina. It uses the energy that the whole of Argentina uses, Bitcoin. So when all the machines stop, I'm sure everybody's read that story, the jig will be up. But this happens every single generation, every single generation. There are like train track schemes, we're going to build a railway to Alaska from Norway. Every generation has its own. Con people are absolutely amazing. They're geniuses, but it's different every time.
We've probably got time for maybe just one or two more questions. There's one that's really interesting in here from Elisa McDonald, Spring and Atlas. I'm not sure if that's one name. True or false, there are more and more twisted true crimes amongst the wealthy than the poor, despite common cliches about the lower orders? Or in other words, where there's cash, there's crime. Where there's money, there's murder. What do we think?
Well, I think people with money are now being prosecuted, whereas before you would just walk away. You just go to, the brilliant Jane Gardam book called Old Filth, and filth stands for filled in London, try Hong Kong. That's what they used to call people who went off to live in. It's a brilliant book. But that's what you used to do, was if you were rich and you killed your wife here, you just went off to live in Kenya or Hong Kong or somewhere. And now people are actually, because we live in an international world. So I think it's just more visible. I don't think it's that.
I think there's something where it's actually quite, particularly in fiction, it's quite good to have that juxtaposition with, sort of lovely surroundings with some horrendous crime taking place. And that's why so many dramas sort of work on that basis. So what was the one with Hugh Grant and Nicole Kidman earlier in the year?
What was it called?
Oh God, I can't remember, but that was absolutely that. So sort of, $1 million New York
I
property.
spent half my life shouting at the television, they can't afford that house.
Yeah. I think that one in particular, it was set in New York and had 0 New York cast members. Everybody was British or Australian, or yeah. So I think that's an interesting juxtaposition, and probably true in true crime as well. I mean, look at the OJ case. That was because it was very wealthy people, amongst a lot of other things as well. Has anybody seen the OJ Made in America documentary?
Oh, it's brilliant.
Which is like 7 hours long, but it's fantastic. It's just, it really sort of gives you that perspective and something you thought you knew everything about at this stage. But I only watched it last year during lockdown. But if you've not seen that, that's fantastic.
There's a fantastic podcast called You're Wrong About, and they're now doing OJ. And but it's about it's just fantastic. It's great. But they're doing OJ and they're giving you the biographies of all the lawyers and stuff like that.
The OJ stuff is wild, particularly when you see that he is now just, I guess, living his life on Twitter in a series of Florida strip clubs, seemingly with no repercussions whatsoever for this. Well,
yeah, so I saw one guy saying Twitter, like, OJ always looks like he's having such a good time, whereas I sometimes lie awake at 2 a.m. thinking about something Mina said to somebody in high school. And it's, Okay, so probably get time for one last one. Let's go with, would any of you write a locked room mystery? Maybe some of you already have. I don't think I have.
I've written a locked room true crime story. It happened in Argentina. It happened in Buenos Aires. And so I went there and I got to investigate and see all the sites and that kind of thing. Alberto Nisman was a lawyer who was writing, he was just about to publish, the next day he was presenting to Parliament this true crime account of the bombing of the Israeli, or the Jewish History Foundation in the middle of Buenos Aires. They blew it up and they killed about 50 people. And he was just about to go into Parliament the next day and say the president was responsible. And that night his mum couldn't get into his house. And he was found in a locked bathroom, in a locked apartment, having been shot through the head with a gun that he didn't own. And so I spent quite a lot of time investigating that. It was fantastic. I don't want to tell you what happens because it just unfolds and unfolds and unfolds and unfolds. It's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. So yes, that's the long answer.
Anybody else?
I've really short attention span. I'd get bored too quickly. I admire anyone who can do it, but yeah, I terrible. Like once I know I start getting bored at my own writing, I've got to bring in a twist somewhere. And I don't know, I think I'd struggle with just a locked room mystery. I like to get out and about and explore settings and things. So no, I couldn't do it myself.
I think it is a particular skill. It's sort of being able to sort of work out that puzzle and make it something that nobody can guess easily. So I know Adrian McKenty's really good at that. I think he's done it a couple of times, but I don't think I've actually got the right type of brain to do that. Joseph, how about you?
I would like to take a stab at it, but who knows?
It's almost like just coming up with a great idea first, and then you can, ideally the book would write itself, although it never seems to be that easy, does it? So I don't know if we're just going to be unceremoniously kicked off or if there's going to be a countdown or something, but I guess we can just sort of keep talking until the clock runs out. And we've got sort of about a minute or two left. I'll just see if we've got another one.
We could sing a song. We could
sing a song. Yeah, I could start sort of shaving into the 70s mustache that I'm contemplating.
We could get a 70s mustache and we could plan a heist, because who would ever put us together? Do you know what I mean? you need to go for that. Oh, we won't be kicked off.
Oh, we're not. Okay, good. Okay, so we've got a question from Ali Kennedy. Do you ever hope you'll be the one to break open a cold case or shed new light on a case you're researching? I think personally, that's something I've always wanted to do, even before I was a writer, just because I like to place myself at the centre of any drama. But does that sort of chime with any of you guys?
Caroline, you must want to. You're a cop through and through.
There's some great, as you mentioned earlier, there's some great Facebook groups and Reddit groups that have solved cases. There was one of the unknown hiker, I don't know if you've heard about that, it's probably don't have much time to go into it now, but basically he was found, he was a hiker. He used to meet everyone on his travels, and he was just found dead in his tent, and there was nothing, they couldn't see, there was nothing apparently wrong with him. He just died of starvation. He had food with him, he had money, everything, and no one knew who he was. And they, sorry, that's my Alexa. And and they solved it. Yeah, they solved it online, and it was really interesting. So look that up. But yeah, I'd love to be part of something like that. It's quite time consuming though.
Here's your reminder. Feed the dog.
So Alexa has sort of told us that our time is up. So I'd just like to thank Steve and Luca for having us on the panel, and all of the fantastic panelists who have made me not have to do much work on the questions, and all of the great questions from the audience. I think we've had about 200 people, which is fantastic. I think there's links to buy the various books, so please do that if you found any or all of us interesting. And yeah, thanks for tuning in, and I hope you found it as fun as we did.
Thanks, everyone.
That was brilliant. Thanks so much. That was really good fun.